Hello, class. We have now arrived at Hebrews chapter 3, and in this lecture we'll look at verses 1 through 19. And here we see on the title slide, Christ is superior to Moses. And previously, the writer to Hebrews was establishing that Christ is superior to the angels, and now he's moving more along in his argument that Christ is superior to Moses. So let's read verse number 1. We see Moses and Jesus contrasted now. Therefore, he says, Holy brethren, partakers of our heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession. The author moves on to the second pillar of Judaism, Moses, which I already alluded to. The two terms, holy brethren and partakers of a heavenly calling, clearly, I want to emphasize, clearly indicate the author is writing to true, genuine believers. The author wants the readers to consider Jesus as being superior to Moses. Remember, as we started out this epistle, Jesus is the most recent revelation, and the most recent revelation of Jesus is superior to the previous revelation, which was the law of Moses. The writer emphasizes that Jesus was sent from God to usher in a new dispensation by referring to him as the apostle. The Greek word that's translated apostle here is apostolos, and it means one who is sent. And so Jesus was sent from God to usher in this new era here, and that's why he's referred to as apostle. He was sent by the Father. Jesus is also referred to as high priest, which calls attention to his role as our representative before God. And we, on our last lecture, we looked at that somewhat. And so he represents mankind and who have faith in him, that is Jesus, faith in Jesus, before God the Father as our mediator. And he's the perfect mediator. He's God, and he's also man. And the word confession indicates talking about himself and the writer, and also the ones he's writing to. All he's talking about is our confession, which means we have confessed that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, and accepted the gospel, and by faith realized they're sinners and turned to Jesus and for forgiveness of sins and enablement to live a life that pleases God, and have a hope to be with as well with God for eternity. And so it indicates the readers have publicly confessed their faith in Jesus as the Messiah. So this is an important verse of who the recipients are. Then we look at verse 2. Still referring to Jesus, he was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all his house. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. See, he's superior. That's the argument that the writer is making. Just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now, Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ, in contrast, was faithful as a son, not as a servant, over his house. So Moses as a servant, Jesus as a son, whose house we are. The writer says he's referring to the church. If we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. So let's look at the commentary. Moses was faithful in all his house. The word house here is referring to the house of Israel, or the nation of Israel. The evidence that Jesus is superior in faithfulness here to Moses, and we look at it. Jesus is the builder of the house, while Moses was a part of the house being built. So you see the superiority there. Jesus is Lord over the house. Moses was in the house. Jesus was faithful as a son over his house, while Moses was faithful in all his house. So he is within the house, not over it as was Jesus. So we see the superiority in those wording here and the context here in these verses of Jesus to Moses. Look at these verses. We see in verses 7 through 11 a warning, a second warning. We have seen one warning previous to this. This is the second one, and this danger is the danger of disobedience. So he wants these Jewish believers who are being persecuted not to disobey God, to walk by faith, in other words, even though they're being persecuted. So let's read. Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, and he quotes from the Old Testament, from the Psalms, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me, and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So God was angry with the children of Israel in the Exodus, in the wilderness wanderings came about as a consequence. Let's look at the commentary. The writer believes the recipients of his letter are in danger of repeating the sin of their forefathers at Kadesh Barnea. After God redeemed the children of Israel from their bondage in Egypt, they were led to the border of the promised land that God promised to, the land he promised to give to the descendants of Abraham. The admonition, do not do here in this epistle to the current generation he's writing to. Don't do to Jesus what the nation of Israel, Jews, did to Moses back at Kadesh Barnea. The children of Israel provoked God at Kadesh Barnea. So we see more commentary here. Representatives from the 12 tribes were sent into the land to survey the land, which could only be possessed by faith, we see from Numbers chapter 13. And so they sent 12 tribes to survey the land, the promised land. The representatives brought back, of the 12, a realistic report concerning the wealth of the land. It is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey, but also of the obstacles to their possession. Yeah, they got giants there. So let's look at the bullets under this. It says Joshua and Caleb called on the people. They were the two, of the 12 spies, they were the two that had faith in God's promises. They called on the people to believe God and take him at his word that he would fight their battles for them against these giants, and he would give them the land. However, the people refused to believe either Joshua or Caleb or God himself. That's called unbelief. This unbelief led to overt rebellion in Numbers 14. Due to the intervention of Moses, the people were delivered from death, physical death. But they were deprived of the enjoyment of the privileges promised in the land of rest. So they were judged. God was angry. They didn't have faith. So they were judged and punished by having to wander 40 years in the wilderness, and only Joshua and Caleb and the descendants of these who did have any faith could enter, but not them. They would die in the wilderness. Then we see here in more commentary, the author of Hebrews quotes Psalms 95, 7 through 11 to give the same encouragement, exhortation as the psalmist did to his generation when he wrote Psalms 95. He invites his readers to acknowledge that God as creator is worthy to be worshipped. Well, that should go without saying, but amazingly, some people don't really grasp that. But yeah, he created all things. We belong to him. We're part of the creation. And he is certainly worthy to be worshipped. The readers could repeat the rebellion of their forefathers, those Jews in the wilderness and at Kadesh Barnea, who had no faith. If they did not respond in faith and suffer the loss, if they did, they would suffer a loss of privileges as well. So, like those at Kadesh Barnea. The writer appeals to his recipients not to become discontented because of their suffering and let discontentment give way to rebellion against God. That's rebellion against God will have judgment and consequences. So look at verse number 12. Here we look at the title here, the consequences of not walking by faith. That's what the writer is, the message he's trying to warn them. There are consequences if you don't live your life by faith, even if you're being persecuted. He says, take care, brethren. See, again, he calls them brethren because they're believers. That there not be any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. That's what you call backsliding. A warning against falling away, we see here, is what this is. So look at the three bullets under that. The writer views the recipients as believers, their brethren. Even though they were saved by faith, they might not choose to live by faith. Yeah, that's the issue here. You got to patiently endure your persecutions. That's what the issue is here. Live by faith. Such unbelief that is not walking by faith would cause them to eventually lose fellowship with God and be judged. Here we continue to look at the consequences of not walking by faith. Let's read verses 13 through 15. He says, you should encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Yes, sin will harden your heart. Every time you resist God and rebel and do what you want to do, it will harden your heart. Verse 14, for we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance from firm until the end, and that's patiently endure your persecution. While it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. And he's still referring back to Kadesh Barnea, the rebellion there. So let's look at the commentary. The author urges the readers to encourage those who are about to fall away because of persecution. And it was, it's pretty severe. Many lost their homes. Many were put in prison. So it's not like a light thing. It was pretty severe in their lives. They were already partakers of Christ. We know from these verses. But continuing to do so until the end would be the final evidence of it. He says, patiently endure. Be an overcomer through your faith. The writer quotes Psalms 95:7, urging, do not harden your hearts. That's what happens when you resist God. He wants you to be steadfast, and he wants all believers, them and us too, as a practical application. When we resist God and refuse to take that stand he wants us to do, we're hardening our hearts against him. Broken fellowship produces callousness toward God. The fact that fellowship is broken because we don't continue to live by faith. believers are responsible for their own conduct and for exhorting other believers who are not availing themselves of God's support. So, that's a good lesson for us all today as well. We'll continue to look at these verses where he continues to expound on the consequences of not walking by faith. They're not good. They're not good consequences. Verse 16, for who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? What was the sin? Not believing that God's promises that he would indeed give them that land and he would fight their battles, and he promised that, and that's a sin. They didn't believe it. This is rebellion. The writer's generation here in the book of Hebrews was in a similar situation to that of their forefathers at Kadesh Barnea. The Exodus generation that was redeemed from Egypt failed to enter the promised land and died in the wilderness because they failed to continue in faith, patiently endure. Thus, it is possible for a redeemed people to respond in unbelief to God's promises. It's backsliding. Yes, there are backsliding in the church today among believers. And this is a good example for us to look at today. The writer's generation was in a similar situation, and if they failed to walk in faith according to the superior revelation of Jesus Christ, it would arouse the wrath of God's judgment. There are consequences for not walking and living your life by faith. And if you don't walk by faith in what he has given us through his word, then you're doing it your way, not his way. You're living your life your way, not his way. And that's the definition of sin. And we continue to look at it. I thought I hit the thing here. And that was the end of the lecture. I'm sorry. So my sources, again, Dwight Pentecost, A Faith That Endures, is a study of the book of Hebrews, and Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Ariel's Bible Commentary, the Messianic Jewish Epistles. And so those are my sources, and that concludes this lecture.